Welcome to the latest episode of the Vandenberg Coalition series, How to Win, where we take a deep dive on the challenges facing the United States military and the Department of Defense. Today we're talking about the Navy, its role in American strategy, and the importance of getting sea power right if we want American foreign policy and defense policy to work on the grand scale. I'm excited to be joined today by Dr. Jerry Hendrix of the Sagamore Institute and Brent Sadler from the Heritage Foundation to talk about this important issue. Both of them are retired naval officers with many years of service at sea, and both have written extensively about American foreign policy, national security, and Navy issues. Let's dive in. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure to be here.
So, Jerry, I wanted to start with you. A couple years ago, you wrote a book about why naval primacy is America's first best strategy. And I think a lot of people, especially, or even in the defense world, think of defense as kind of one big bubble. Could you give us an idea as a historian and as a naval strategy, why are navies different and why, what sets them apart?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to unpack that assumption that sort of military is kind of an all of the above choice. First of all, one of the arguments I made in that is that since the end of World War II, and especially after the Cold War, we had an ability to kind of choose an all the above strategy. We could be a continental power and a maritime sea power. And the fact is right now with a mounting budget and also sort of the geostrategic situation in the world, I think that the trends are forcing us into an area where we have to make a choice. And I think we have to become a sea power again. The importance of the sea is that, 80% of global trade travels by sea. And it's an important source of American wealth, and wealth is power. That's something that Mahan taught us over a century ago. And so making sure that we protect our sea lines of communication, that we fully engage on the sea aspect of our economy, understanding its importance. We can certainly look at what's going on in the Red Sea right now, both above water and below water with the interdiction of the undersea cables. And we understand the critical vulnerability that we have at sea, but also the tremendous power that we generate from the sea. So navies are different in the sense that navies are out and about all the time. Peacetime, wartime, the Navy is forward deployed, doing forward presence. That is something that is unique amongst all the military services. The Army comes home, goes into garrison. The Air Force can surge outward, but is very limited because of how long, how much fuel can be in an airplane. But the Navy goes and it persists. And so that's what makes us different.
You use the term sea power there. Can you give us a little more detail or a definition of what makes a country a sea power?
Well, there's been only a very limited number of sea powers across history. You have to go back to the Carthaginians, the Athenians. Those were sea powers. Then you had the Venetians, and then Great Britain and the Dutch. We were the last of the sea powers. We emerged as a continental power or as a sea power. After our revolution, we actually made our constitution and we tailor-fit it to be a sea power. That's why you must provide and maintain a Navy in Article 1, Section 8, whereas the Navy is a raised and supported service. So it's episodic, it's periodic. The Navy is there to persist. So we understood that we were a sea power, that we were dependent upon continental trade with Europe. And that's the way that the founders wanted us to operate. We've sadly walked away from that understanding in the last 70 years or so.
So, Brent, turning to you, you also recently authored a book and looking forward to naval power in the 21st century. And so I was wondering if you could expound a little bit on the idea you flesh out in the book about naval statecraft and what is that and why do you think that's the right tool for America in the 21st century?
Yeah, thanks. And it's great being here with Jerry, an old shipmate and friend as well. And a great book, by the way, that Jerry also put out. When I came at this was from a perspective of how can you get inside the strategy and the mindset of your adversaries. And it's first and foremost China, but also understanding at the same time that if you just fixate on China, you're going to get distracted by the other urgent necessaries. I mean, this administration is being reminded about that they have to divert a lot of attention and resources to Ukraine, also to Middle East yet again, with the Houthis and Hamas kicking up the dust at the behest of the Iranians. So you also have to consider the one that could cause you the most problems and distraction, and that's the Russians. And so the book was how do you actually get inside their strategic cultures in both capitals and do it in a way that you play at their weaknesses. And for all the reasons that Jerry just laid out, it all speaks to a maritime strategy, a maritime approach. But at the same time, you have to embrace the economics and the politics here at home because if you don't do that, you're not going to have something that's sustainable. Navies are wickedly expensive. They are also extremely complicated technologically, and so you have to merge the politics, the high end of that, and then you also have to merge it with the deep, very geeky world of technology. Not exactly a very easy synthesis. And then the economics, which is really the core of this naval statecraft. You merge economic statecraft with diplomacy and maritime presence. It's the right mix, and you play it at certain decisive theaters. The Chinese and the Russians won't be able to compete, and you do it at cost.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us maybe an example of how you see that playing out or applied to a problem the United States is facing today, and how is that different than kind of the other acronyms we hear of, we need to approach a problem with DIME and diplomacy, information, military economics. How is naval statecraft different?
Yeah, so I tried to be very careful in the book not to provide just some new strategy, which is a lot of nice words and acronyms, but really doesn't mean anything new, like integrated deterrence. These are all things that kind of point in the direction, but they don't really tell you what and how, and naval statecraft actually goes there. And so some of the key things, I'll go give you a sea story. The one case where naval statecraft actually played out before it was actually a thing, and that was the West Kapala incident, which played out in the South China Sea. The Chinese were intimidating a contracted survey vessel that Malaysia's national oil producer had actually chartered to go survey because they needed to continue to find new oil reserves if they're going to balance their federal budget. And the Chinese were not having it. But because that was 2020 was also an election year in Taipei, it's a national crisis waiting that you can look in a calendar and say, okay, we better be prepared. So the U.S. Navy was nearby. And rather than saying that we're there to keep the peace, our leadership at the time, because they were operating in, at the time, an internal-only document, a strategic framework for the Indo-Pacific, the naval leadership, the 7th Fleet Admiral, who I had been a flag lieutenant before way back when, basically said for the first time, the U.S. Navy is present here to safeguard everyone's economic rights in their own waters. And the region, Southeast Asia, has been very apprehensive about the military gamesmanship that's been playing out in their neighborhood. They actually welcomed that. And then what followed afterwards is you had the Secretary of State Pompeo months later after B-52s buzzed the region, and there was more aircraft carrier strike came into the air. All of this heavier military presence that was really there for Taiwan was now associated with economic livelihood of partners in the region. And the Secretary of State said the following: China's claims in the South China Sea are illegal. Had you done that the other way around, the region would have recoiled. And again, it's the merging of the economics. And again, in this case, it was the survey rights of the seabed so that Malaysia could continue to balance their federal budgets. But it was with a naval presence, because you're over the horizon. You're not on the land and in people's communities. It allowed the politics on shore to play out. So that's a case of where it played out. I'd love to say it was by design, but it wasn't. It was by luck. And so that's why the book was important, to kind of lay it out and bring that case out and say, we need to be better. I see some of this right now in the way we engage the Philippines. We are taking a much more muscular approach with the Filipinos, but at the same time, economics, we're involved in the economic development of the Philippines as we're bringing back more basing, more access. So that's the future. You can't have diplomacy as one line of effort, information or societal, a separate cylinder of excellence, and the military off by itself. It has to be all connected also with the economics, not just American, the homeland's economics, but also the target country or your partner country.
Could one or both of you give us an idea? It seems like, strategically this all makes sense. It's a logical argument, but for whatever reason, it hasn't penetrated minds at the Pentagon. It's not, this is an idea that we have to sell. So what are kind of the roadblocks, in the bureaucracy and in the Pentagon to bringing naval power more to the forefront of U.S. defense policy?
Well, first of all, I think you have to start that culturally, there is not a leader in the Pentagon today that hasn't effectively come of age in the post-Cold War world. So they've existed in the post-Goldwater-Nichols era, the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, which effectively sort of legislatively enforced the idea of sort of a one-third approach to defense spending, that we would have a balance within the joint force, emphasizing the joint force over everything else. So essentially, the entire generation of current leadership we have, both civilian, who's been obviously in academia or in think tanks or in the business world, as well as the military, have never existed in a paradigm other than this. And unfortunately, far too few of our leaders are actually historically well-read to be able to understand that there was a paradigm before this where we actually made hard choices based upon strategic decisions that were made at a presidential level. So, Eisenhower really effectively emphasized the Air Force, and the Air Force made up over 40% of the defense budget during the Eisenhower administration. Reagan emphasized the Navy, and the Navy spending really shot up there at the end of the Cold War because he saw it as a tool to enforce his we win, they lose strategy to the Cold War, and he used submarines really effectively to help do that, as well as surging aircraft carriers. So most of the leadership today were commissioned in the late 1980s when I first came in, or even into the 90s, and so they have no idea of sort of what came before.
Yeah, I was going to add there's a structural problem too. So part of the Goldwater-Nichols Act legacy is that you have geographic combatant commands. We've divided the world up based on land, not the realities at sea. And we did before shortly before the 1947 National Security Act, before we merged the War Department with the Department of the Navy, you had a land and a sea, and then you kept the Navy until Goldwater-Nichols had a global perspective. So structurally, we've tethered ourselves to the terrestrial, to the land, and it's not a good fit when you're trying to operate a Navy most effectively, both for strategic effect on your adversary, but also most economically. And there's lots of cases. I can go from like the Indian Ocean, you got 3 different commands, geographic commands, all fighting for assets. And so you get duplicative efforts.
And if an oil tanker is going from the Middle East to China, it's crossing those boundaries. And once it's over the line, I don't really care about it anymore. It's someone else's problem.
That's right. And again, most of those geographic commanders, CENTCOM, at the top of my list, they're focused in on what's happening on land. And it's how can the Navy get me what I need to the land? How can the Navy help me make an impact on the folks on land? But they're not really thinking about what happens at sea. And increasingly, we're looking at a system versus system. And so shipping, this is what's playing out right now. That's a different kind of mindset, because if you're a geographic commander and you're worried about the countries in the Middle East, your real targets, Beijing and Moscow. Those aren't in that geographic commander's portfolio.
Yep. And one of the things I wrote last year in an article in The Atlantic was the idea that the ocean has become assumed. And that's become assumed by the American people, but it's also been assumed by our American military commanders, who just assume that we're going to be able to cross the ocean and supplies are going to be there and the Navy will provide. And the Navy is there as a support force to the land and air components. Well, that's not the way the world actually operates. That in fact, the ocean is predominantly the commons areas right now. The sea, air, and space, and cyber are the 3 domains in which the competition is actually being played out in a semi-hot war right now. And so understanding we need to shift from that land anchor that we've had around our minds, strategically anchoring our mentality, back to the commons and understanding that's where the competition is playing out as we speak.
So thinking, kind of structurally and in terms of the size of the Navy and number of ships, I was wondering if you guys could give us a view of, how have we gotten to where we are, where we're at a position where we have the smallest Navy, I think, since World War I, and over the past several years, the past decade, we've been trying to turn that ship around, if you'll pardon the metaphor, but to no avail.
Yeah. Well, Jerry and I both have, I think, a lot of history on this one, and it would probably give you much the same answer. I would say where we are now, where we need to go, it's clear that we need a much larger fleet. So I don't think there's any argument with that. 355 is not the goal. It's just the goal right now. And that goal was set back in 2016, early 2017, put into law. And we've actually gone in the opposite direction. Part of that is because ships are expensive. The other part of it is ships take years to build. So you have to maintain the political commitment with those resources, not for just one budget cycle, but for multiple. And that works against Navy. And that's a structural, institutional part of it. The other issue is it always seems to be that we've been able to live off the Cold War legacy, the fat of the military that we had, and we paid back for the Navy. It's like $1.2 trillion peace dividend. Now that's more than fat, that's muscle and that's bone of the naval structure that we've given up. And it's going to take money to get that back. And it was easy to cut ships. And it's much harder politically and resource-wise to add ships. So that's working against us.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect of this, too, is that we've been in a sort of a sunk cost strategic mindset for a long period of time. The Navy today, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, is effectively the same force structure, at least conceptually. It's the same pyramid as what we've had over the previous 70 years. And yet we're seeing the innovation is moving out. So guided missiles really came to predominance in the 50s, and they've risen. We failed to sort of adjust in the way that they would truly play out, what their full implications are. Also, right now, we're looking at the rise of AI and unmanned, and the Navy hasn't gotten its mind around exactly where that fits in and how much of the force structure that'll make up. As we move forward, we haven't really war gamed or done CONOP development on those things. So we're really, because we build ships and then they last 30 years, in many ways, we build a mindset and we've been deeply invested in that mindset. It's very hard to shift or change course to be able to really change the size and structure of the fleet. I think that we need 456 ships was the number that I brought up in my book, 4 years ago. But the size and composition of that fleet looks dramatically different than the fleet that we currently have. And I always say that if the fleet of the future looks like the fleet that we have today, then we've made a huge strategic mistake because the world is changing rapidly around us.
Yeah, I was wondering if both of you, I think in your books, lay out kind of a vision for the future, a roadmap that does look different than what we have today. And I think most casual viewers or even people who are plugged into defense world have an image of that pyramid of, aircraft carriers on top, flanked by destroyers and cruisers and submarines and so on. Could you both give us an idea of bringing in new technologies, unmanned ships, directed energy weapons, things like that? How do you see those being incorporated, and how does your vision of what the future U.S. Navy looks like differ from what we think of today?
Yeah, I'd start first thing is you have to apply good, sound engineering principles, and too often that's not the case. And the consequence of that is massive cost overruns, platforms that are not adaptable enough or are not built for the mission that they. And I think most people know what platforms I'm talking about. But
could you, just for those who don't?
Well, the littoral combat ship is one. It served a purpose. It still has utility. But what it was designed for was for a time and period in the world that doesn't exist. And so you have to build in adaptability.
Where we have that assumed sea that Jerry was talking about. Everything's safe and we can just kind of...
And we built a ship around that idea. Which is not, I'm saying the design and the idea as it originally was conceived was the right thing. But I actually, in the book, I riff off of Oliver Cromwell, New Model Army, and I say New Model Navy. And it was a change of the center of gravity of the British, at that time, the rebels against the royalists. It was a shifting from a regional-based, militia-based force to the one that was national. We have to go to one that's naval statecraft kind of centered. In other words, it's got the economics and the diplomatic aspects of it, but also anchored in to the oceans as they exist. So regionalized. So a focus in on the numbered fleets. And then how do you leverage that in the new technologies? There's a growing place for robotic systems. This is the unmanned ships. The artificial intelligence that enables that, but it also enables the decisions that go faster from the human operators or commanders. So there's that, and I'd also add there's some other technology that doesn't get enough play, and that's bioengineering. So DARPA actually is already far along in this to some very scary future, but we should embrace it for a lot of reasons. And it's the bioengineering where you have living systems that are actually performing a function for the ships. And that's an interesting, probably a rabbit hole to go in if you want to, but we need a new model Navy to match the naval statecraft. That is how we're going to win this new Cold War.
Yeah, so I think, three things to think about just on the question that you asked there, which is, understand that an unmanned ship, a true unmanned AI-driven ship, is going to look dramatically different. And in fact, if it looks very similar to what we have today, then we've made a mistake. Because a true unmanned ship, well, it doesn't have bunks, it doesn't have a kitchen, it doesn't have plumbing for bathrooms and heads. In fact, you design it around that unmanned mission and you streamline it for lethality. And so that ship would look dramatically different. Until you start seeing designs that reflect sort of a dramatic change, then you really understand that the Navy hasn't firmly embraced some of these capabilities. One of the other things you mentioned, directed energy. Clearly something that we have to watch very closely because it's only thing that has a potential to do missile defense against maneuvering missiles. And with hypersonics and boost glide and maneuverability in the terminal phase, that's something we got to get our mind around. It took us 30 years to get ballistic missile defense. Now we have a whole new mathematical problem in trying to get a maneuvering hypersonic. So it's not ballistic. It's not on a set arc. I've got to find a way of predicting where it's going to go, get ahead of it. I'm going to need a directed energy weapon, which means I'm going to need a really big power plant to generate enough energy to do that. That's going to change ship design in the way that when we moved from coal to fuel oil to nuclear power, that dramatically changed internal ship designs. We should be anticipating and starting to see that, but we're not yet, which tells me that we haven't firmly embraced. I think we have to create an unmanned community of interest within the Navy in much the same way that you have submarines and the surface force and the aviation force. You're really going to need to create an unmanned community where we're going to really test and stretch to see how much we can get out of an unmanned platform, really test its concept of operations. And I think that in many ways we may have to do that away from fleet concentration centers where the established fleet sort of has interest that it wants to protect. So I'm trying to stir the pot and move us in a new direction with unmanned.
Yeah, just to add on to
Sure.
that. So back in 15 to 16 with the third offset, this manned and unmanned teaming, there was an effort to do that. The Navy actually stood up a dedicated office. It never really got down far enough downrange to actually have an impact before it was disestablished. There is a need to actually embrace. We need like an Admiral Rickover that was for the Navy nuclear program. We need the same kind of visionary, forceful, perhaps just as abrasive as Admiral Rickover was, to really bring this to the next level. And
someone who can really be the pioneer for this in the face of it.
And has the vision and also the discipline and the engineering fundamentals at the same time, the political acumen to get it over and past all of the legacy. The other thing to say is it's important as we're in transition from one type of era of naval warfare to another, is that you want to hedge your bets at the same time. And this, by happenstance, is where we were on the day of Pearl Harbor. We had aircraft carriers, we had battleships, and we had submarines. The aircraft carrier and the submarine to a lesser extent, but the aircraft carrier was kind of the new thing. If we had only had aircraft carriers, we may have also been in a bad place. If we had only had battleships, we clearly would have been in a bad place, but no one knew. But because we had the combination, we could run a submarine offensive while we built up our aircraft and our pilots and the aircraft carriers to actually take the fight to the Japanese. You have to hedge at the same time that you're pushing. And I'm very optimistic about what I'm seeing with like Task Force 59, and that's learning by doing. And now it's being replicated in 4th Fleet in Southern Command. And it's also being, they're doubling down now in not necessarily in 7th Fleet, but in Pacific Fleet.
So it sounds like besides, kind of those areas you mentioned there at the end, there does appear to be, from what you're saying, some bureaucratic stickiness kind of within the Pentagon and within the Navy hierarchy. Going back to what you were saying at the beginning, that, folks have come up through this kind of system that we're in right now and aren't necessarily geared up for the next thing. What kind of political leadership from either the Secretary of Defense, Navy Secretary, President, or Congress can help move along into this new era and revitalize the Navy?
So I'm going to give you 2 historical examples because I think the point that you just touched upon, and I'm going to press that button really hard, is that it takes strong civilian political leadership to change the Navy, or for that matter, any service. 2 examples. So in the Eisenhower administration, we made a decision that we're going to put an intermediate range ballistic missile that's solid rocket propelled on a nuclear powered submarine. We came up with that idea in 1954. We said yes in 1955. That first submarine deployed in the winter of 1961, January of 1961. 5.5 years from an idea's conception to an operational deployment. All right. Ronald Reagan comes in, 30 years later with his administration. He has a young Secretary of the Navy, in his late 30s, comes in with the idea about the 600-ship Navy, fully engages the industrial base. We add in 150 ships. Actually, it was a net plus up of 84, but we had some decommissionings in there, so it was a net 84 plus 150 over time. But we came in with a plan and we rolled. And it was because you had a president with a vision, he had a chain of command that had that common vision, they communicated it effectively, and they drove it through the Navy uniform bureaucracy, which was resistant to change in both cases. With Eisenhower, you had Tom Gates as the Navy secretary and undersecretary. You had a really great, strong assistant secretary who went out and found Arleigh Burke and elevated him 108 numbers up the list to promote a 2-star to a 4-star because he was going to be a change agent. If today we're going to change the military, it's not going to come from within the uniforms. It's going to come from a strong civilian leadership team that comes in with a common vision and drives it through the system.
Yeah, I would just, so I would add that there are flag officers out there. We may need to do another Arleigh Burke, but you got to pick wisely. And then if the president or the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of the Navy have made a mistake, they need to move that individual on quickly. There's no time for being a gentleman about an issue like national defense.
Have your 4 years, and then
You're
we'll
not
find
going to get
another,
your 2 or your 4. It's like as soon as like six months in, just like this isn't working, gone. So there is a need, and this is going back to Secretary Lehman's tenure, important of actually having those very aggressive officers that also are of the same vision to run exercises like Ocean's Venture, and to go and take the fleet in the direction it needs to very aggressively and confidently. There's no time for.
Could you explain that example for folks? It's a good one.
Ace Lyons was a god.
Yes, this is the admiral. So Secretary Lehman had known this admiral, Ace Lyons, before, knew of his demeanor, and so when he came into the administration, he very rapidly made sure that these admirals that were key, and Lyons in particular, to actually take these exercises, large fleet movements that were going to get the Soviets' attention early, because he needed to show operationally that the direction that the Navy was going to go in was going to have an effect on the Soviets. And
we're going to prove this concept.
We're going to prove it.
This is the new thing we're doing, and this is how it works.
And so they got the intel, came back, and again, at the time, it was all very behind the curtain, but he could go to Congress and said, look, I just did this exercise. If I have more ships, and I can do it over in the Pacific, and I can do it over in the Indian Ocean, I can do it with more scale, the Soviets are already worried about it, and they basically read them the intel that said, look, they're taking notice. So you have to have an early win. Operations are one way to get that early win, and you also need to know the uniformed officers that you can rely on to execute those operations early on. So it's important, but it also means breaking some glass. Going and finding perhaps a 1-star and elevating them to a fleet command, because that 1-star is the one that's got the disposition and the demeanor that you need for that.
In the Cold War, we actually kept a document which was, sort of referred to jokingly as in case of war break glass document, where we identified captains and flag officers, 1 and 2 stars, who would be elevated to fleet and strike group commands in the event of war, people who would be aggressive war fighters. We recognized in peacetime, there's a peacetime mentality. You're a programmer, you're a budgeteer, you're here to protect the Navy's interests. Those are not war fighters. By the way, we saw that prior to World War II. We completely swapped out the Navy's leadership team at the beginning of World War II and put war fighters in charge. We maintained that lesson learned throughout the Cold War. We always knew who we would go to. Ace Lyons was one of those names that had been sort of culled out and looked at and understood that that was a guy who was a war fighter. Today, again, some 30 years after the end of the Cold War, I'm not sure that we have that in case of war break glass list around anymore.
You both mentioned kind of political leadership from the White House and the Pentagon. And earlier on, you talked about some of the structural limitations on people's mindsets and on budgets, Goldwater Nichols and the combatant command structure. Obviously, the budget is the big one. Congress, at the end of the day, decides how many ships to buy and how much, how many sailors to have and so on and so forth. Are there particular things that, Congress needs to be doing now to move us in the right direction and to set us up for success at sea?
Well, I'll take the first bat at this one. And we both have, I think, very rich opinions on this one. So first thing is simple and elegant solutions are the only thing that politically are going to be survivable, and they have to make sense from a business perspective as well as a political perspective. And most importantly, they have to deliver in a timely manner the military power that's going to get the attention of the folks in Beijing and Moscow. And as a student of history as well, I look to the naval acts of the 1930s with a modern flair to it. And so I think that we are at a point in time where a modern naval act that basically looks at what consistently has been asked for the number of ships and the class of the ships, stable designs. So these are ships that have been in production and the design is stable.
We know what they are.
We know what they are. We know the Navy needs this many, but yet we go through this every year drill where we up a little, down a little, delay a little. And all that does is it costs more and it delays the delivery of ships. So just wrap it all up, say that 10 frigates, 10 Arleigh Burke Flight 3s, 10 Virginia class, Virginia payload module types, 2 aircraft carriers over the next 5 years. Here's the budget.
We're just going to buy it all at once.
As a naval act, because the other problem is that it also mitigates the problem that we are in this defense budget, where if you were to do a naval act, it would break the defense budget. So you have to pull that out. And it has to be, because ships are unique, they take years to build, and it's massive infrastructure investments that need to be made because of the peace dividend that we have cashed in already. It's very expensive to turn that over. We're learning that now just on building artillery rounds.
So I actually call for what I call a SHIPS Act.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, we had tremendous success. We recognized, Senator Young, Senator Schumer recognized that we had this real strategic vulnerability within microchip production. And so they created the CHIPS Act with the idea of trying to reshore microchip production here in the United States. Well, if anything, the vulnerability we have on our industrial base is huger than in the technical side. Okay, so the type of investment we need isn't just even in building Navy ships. We need commercial ships because commercial ships help us to grow the number of part suppliers, the number of qualified workers. It also reindustrializes a part of the nation that we sort of ignored and walked away from, thinking that the global environment or the global economy is going to provide for us, when in fact there's a heightened amount of vulnerability goes with that. So I want to see the Congress take up a SHIPS Act that invests in not only building the Navy, but building commercial ships and building our industrial base where we produce things again in the United States that we export overseas other than just energy and ideas.
And it really gets to, what Brent was talking about earlier, how, Navy's sea power are much more intertwined in the economic side of things with the merchant marine and with, kind of industrial development like you're talking about than say the Army or the Air Force is, or, more off in their own corner. In that vein, I was wondering if either of you could talk a little bit about any particular challenges within that. We can appropriate money, but with the CHIPS Act, even we've seen in the last couple of weeks, folks talking about how it's hard to find the right workers or there are regulatory hurdles. We appropriate a lot of money to build ships, and I suspect we're going to, run into similar hurdles there. So if you could give us a little bit of an idea of what those might be and how we might get around those problems.
So workforce is the problem. By the way, workforce is the problem for everywhere. Workforce is the problem with the active duty military. If we look at our recruiting numbers and the goals that were there where we're falling short. I look at the SHIPS Act and you have to say, well, I'm not going to be able to build ships in sort of traditional shipbuilding areas or places that have become the traditional shipbuilding areas. We used to build ships everywhere in this country. When we built the Perry-class frigates, we built them East Coast, the Gulf Coast, the West Coast. We had 4 shipyards producing Perry-class frigates. This is during the 1970s and 1980s. So that's not too far long ago. If I start looking at blue-collar workforce today, welders, electricians, pipe fitters, and so on. Where do I find that excess workforce? Well, oddly enough, I find that along the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys. I also find it along the Great Lakes, where we're building frigates today up in Wisconsin. So my thought there is, rather than try to go someplace else in the country and attract a workforce to move there, a workforce, by the way, that is less and less likely to move here in the United States, then in fact, you need to bring that shipbuilding contract to these areas. And by the way, as we look at building large and medium unmanned vessels, which will be smaller in size, perhaps in radically different designs, we could build those in some of these smaller yards along the Ohio and Mississippi River, as well as along the Great Lakes. So make sure that you go to where your workforce is to make those primary investments to modernize some existing yards and get them to ramp up.
Yeah, so there's some good news in this also that I want to shine a light on. Congress is definitely taking notice, and I think the American public is taking notice. It's just inside the Pentagon and inside the White House, it's been late in coming, quite frankly. And that is because we had the post-COVID kind of recovery, the supply chain crises that uncovered, then the Suez Canal crisis where you had a ship turned sideways and shut it down for over a week, and that also caused backlogs. And now you've got, then there was the war in Ukraine and the grain. So there's been incident after incident where people, and then cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline, people's livelihoods have been touched by global supply chain problems. So it's very real. Now, in order to get that naval shipbuilding that we need and that blue collar, the workforce, which actually pays better than a lot of the college educated folks out there, you need to get a commercial sector wide revolution or renovation. And so we really need a national maritime strategy or an initiative. And you've got folks like Senator Kelly from Arizona, who was a merchant marine or was an astronaut, who's been talking about the human capital part, getting more folks that are merchant marines, getting more folks that are working in the shipyards. And then you've also got folks like Representative Waltz from Florida, who also came and spoke at Heritage and basically is laying out an effort to lay out a legislative agenda, also get at the ports, the shipyards. But we have a comparative advantage in the commercial shipbuilding, and it really rests in nuclear power. And we also have some other unique comparative advantages that are not in the maritime sector right now, but could be applied. And pulling that together, we can actually...
Can you give us an example of that?
Well, for one, there's a company that's actually looking at marketing right now heavy lift dirigibles. So think airships, but moving cargo. You've got small modular nuclear reactors. But if you can put them onto a ship, like an ultra-large container ship, backfitted on it, you can actually do what's called fast steaming, where you're not limited by environmental concerns or the cost of the fuel from month to month for the fuel cost. There's also the drones and the unmanned systems. There's blockchain. So think smart ports where you can track cargo and it moves from a ship via a drone, and then it moves from that ship via a feeder vessel to a smaller ports. Or it moves from a dirigible from sea well inland. So you start opening up new centers of transit and logistics nodes. But that nuclear power, that drone technology, and the artificial intelligence, these are some of the key comparative advantages the United States has. But if you pull it together in the right cocktail, you can actually light off an invigoration of American shipping and shipbuilding.
Understand that one of the reasons why in the 1960s, the two of the largest and most rapidly expanding economies in the world were the German economy, the West German economy, and the Japanese economy at that point in time, was because their previous industrial base had been completely destroyed in World War II, and they were able to sort of build from new. The longer economy runs and the more you have sunk cost investment in old infrastructure, the more that economy slows down. So what Brent's just describing there is us essentially revamping and modernizing and trying to do a leap ahead economy where we heavily invest in the technology that comes next in order to get a step up in front. China has made heavy investments in heavy industry, but it's going to face, and it's already facing, a slowdown point here as that industry is aging and suddenly the cost of revamping that industry is becoming overwhelming to them, slowing down their GDP growth. We need to try and get ahead of that next wave.
Yeah, and it's very much, you can see if you look at kind of the graph of American shipbuilding over time. I know both of you are familiar with it, how I think in the 70s we were a top 3 shipbuilder, and then starting in the 80s that really all got captured by the Japanese and the Chinese and Koreans. And now we're at that blank slate, like you're mentioning with the West Germans and the Japanese, and so really primed. And this is, this isn't just a Navy thing, but it's a whole of economy thing if we do it right.
No, and the key is to avoid the I guess the tendency to try to match the Chinese or to out-Chinese the Chinese. And so we also have to be very careful in what's called a blue ocean strategy. Look at where they're not and create new market space. And so Jerry, better than I could, described what part of the effort of this revolution in shipping is meant to be. The other part of it is to create new market space. And so it's harder in a way that the Chinese aren't able to actually get to very easily. And so both of those things, if we do it, we can actually take full advantage of our comparative advantages in the shipping world. And by doing that, we'll attract more people to lucrative jobs in the technical, in the industrial sector, and also in the white collar, because we need more naval architects too. It's a whole nother discussion, which is actually scary, the so few that we actually educate in the United States in this key part of this sector. But if you do that, you'll have the base, you'll have the industry to build naval ships of various varieties in more places at a comparative price, and you'll have more competent people designing them, building them, and therefore you won't have overruns and cost surprises.
Yeah, and this, takes us all the way back around to what we were talking about at the beginning, how sea power is different, how Navy's different. This isn't something you can do the same way with, an Army revitalization or Air Force investment in new aircraft. It's tied into the economy in a different way.
That's why I think, and there's a synergy between what Brent and I are saying here, but also what we've been writing for the last couple of years. We're both coming around to this idea that what we really need is a maritime, not a naval, a maritime national security strategy. That primary document that's brought out by the White House, supposedly within the first year of the administration, that's supposed to guide the way that
and this is a statutory requirement,
that's
right?
That's right. But there's only one administration that's ever actually gotten it done. That was the Trump administration. Actually brought out its NSS in that first year. And I remember there at the rollout. The point here, though, is we need a maritime national security strategy that then sets a priority on the maritime environment, the maritime competition, maritime for the economy, for our diplomacy, for the military as well, and then drive that down into a maritime-led national defense strategy that actually works with Department of Transportation and MARAD to make sure that we're fully leveraging, understanding again that we're going to make a strategic choice to be a sea power state in the world, and then to emphasize that. Now, that means that we're going to have some changes in the way that we operate militarily in the world, that we'll be operating tangentially as influencers from offshore. We'll be enabling the allies and partners with their land forces and perhaps even their air power ashore, but we're there to give them that backstop. We'll be able to launch some missiles. We'll be able to launch some airplanes, but we'll also make sure that the supply line is open, that they're going to be able to continue to get their military supplies from North America over to them, whether it's in Pacific or whether it's in the Atlantic. But understand that I'm suggesting that we take a kind of a completely different strategic approach to the world that emphasizes the maritime. During the time of Great Britain, they talked about the periphery operating against the center. That's something goes back to the Duke of Marlborough and Churchill in World War I and World War II. I think we need to do that periphery against the center type approach on things again.
I just loop back to the need to restructure for the new Cold War that we're in. We did it in 1947-48 when we reorganized for a Cold War of containment against the Soviet Union. We need to do the same thing. And so one specific case is to actually execute a maritime-centered national security strategy is having a maritime department. So right now, the Maritime Administration, MARAD, it's over in the Department of Transportation, buried inside there in a heavily aviation-focused one. You've got NOAA, which would be the science, the intelligence, and kind of the surveying of the world's oceans buried inside commerce. Well, not really buried. They're just kind of there in commerce. Then you've got the Coast Guard, which is your enforcer. They're buried inside Department of Homeland Security, border security, and so many other things with immigration control. And then you've got off on its own the Federal Maritime Commission. Bringing them all together under a cabinet leadership would get it the attention and the visibility to the president, but also most importantly to Congress at the same time to drive forward comprehensively the commercial side of this. The Navy restructuring the Navy and the Pentagon, that's another huge fight. That's a Goldwater Nichols fight. But this other one, the Maritime Department, that's doable right now. And it's not easy, but it's doable with the right type of leadership in place to bring those together. And you're not really building something new. You're just reorganizing, and you might be adding one secretary.
And you're rationalizing things that are scattered around.
Right.
I think the key word that I heard in what both of you said is leverage, right? And being able to think strategically about the maritime domain and about sea power. It gives you leverage that you can apply against different problems.
So the key thing that you just said there is think strategically.
Right.
This is something that, I love my country. I'm a proud American. Americans don't do a good job thinking strategically. We think year to year, day to day. We think that we can reinvent the world anew every day. That's part of our culture. That's why we're such an optimistic people. But we don't think long term. The Chinese don't get up without a 50-year plan. The Russians think in long time, planning sequences. We Americans tend to want to reinvent on the run, which is why we have year-to-year budgets, and we actually wrote that little rule into our Constitution as well. That does not allow us to think long term and to think intelligently in a strategic fashion. We need to recover sort of a strategic mindset amongst our senior leaders. My old boss, Andy Marshall's been gone a few years now. There's not many minds like that walking around who can kind of see out 25 years down the road every day of their lives, thinking ahead. We need a little bit more of that back into the mix.
Well, one final question as we wrap up. The overarching theme for this series is really, with an eye to a new president, potential new Secretary of Defense, in 2025, you get a new chance to start off on the right foot. If you two are advising the next Secretary of Defense or a new presidential administration on this area, what's the number one challenge that you want them to focus on and to be aware of? And what are 1 to 2 kind of policy recommendations to get after that right out of the gate?
Well, I think the first one, as Jerry said, is you need to have very clearly articulated, and I'd say day one, like if not inauguration day, the next day, a national security strategy that is based and centered in on the maritime, and that is centered in and focusing on China and winning the new Cold War. Not simply managing it, but actually getting ahead and winning it. Because without that initiative, that strategic initiative, we lose. And so what does that mean in the first 60 days, 100 days of whatever administration comes next? Change the way we operate the Navy, and also, for that matter, all of the maritime support services, include the Army, and do it in a way that gets Beijing's attention, and that they understand that they're in a foot race, a decades-long foot race with the United States that they're not going to be able to win. So you can do that by the way you operate, and you can do that by coming to a modern version of the Oceans Venture for the 21st century. And I'll probably leave it there.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summation. I think you do have to come in with that first 100 days, first 60 days, first 100 days iteration. You want to look at having a strong team. So I would think that the Wednesday after the election, the very next day, that you start having an idea not just about who's going to be your Secretary of Defense and your Undersecretary, but I want to see a full bench, and I want those names to go across in December so that they're there at noon on January the 20th for an up or down confirmation, essentially, of a very strong Department of Defense team with the Navy's team fully fleshed out. We've had gaps in the Navy front office. I think we just filled the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisitions just within the last couple months. And we're 3 years into the Biden administration, which told you what the priority was on that office within this administration. I think you have to lead strongly. Then you have to have that game plan. I think you also have to plan to how to rapidly expand the fleet, because the strongest signal that I can send to the Chinese is how big the U.S. Navy is. So I would look very carefully at my decommissioning plan and reverse course on a couple of those. I would also look at some ships that have been recently decommissioned and borrow a page out of Reagan's book and bring some ships back out of mothballs to pump up my numbers. Maybe they're older ships. Maybe I send them to places like Fourth Fleet or the South Atlantic, where I can move a lot of my front end stuff into the Western Pacific to make sure that everyone understands where my clear focus is. And then I would take a very strong look at the leadership team. a la the Arleigh Burke review that happened near the beginning of the Eisenhower administration. I'm going to look at the Navy leadership team from 1-star to 4-star, make sure that the people are aligned with a warfighter's mode going forward. And so I think if we could start out that way, administratively strong civilian leadership, looking at your industrial base, and looking at our uniform team, then I think we're on a pretty strong foundation at that point.
Gentlemen, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
And thank you all for watching.